My name is Harper Lawson, and if you'd told me at 18 that I'd be standing here today, unapologetic, accomplished, and finally free, I wouldn't have believed you. Back then, my life was a tightrope stretched over an abyss of disappointment, and every step was measured against my sister, Elise. I'm 32 now, and I've spent nearly half my life trying to unlearn the message my family drilled into me: that my value depended entirely on how well I fit their blueprint. I grew up in San Francisco's Pacific Heights, in a grand Victorian house that was practically a monument to the Lawson legacy. The Lawson name meant something in this city. For over a century, it had been synonymous with elite attorneys, landmark litigation, and the power that came with both. My mother, Victoria Lawson, was a formidable litigator whose courtroom victories were legendary among the legal elite. My father, Charles Lawson, ran the West Coast's most prestigious law firm, where generations of our family had built their careers. From the time I could form memories, I knew I was expected to follow in their footsteps. Every holiday dinner was less about family than about strategy, recent case wins, the latest judicial appointments, and which Lawsons would be named in next month's American Bar feature. The walls were covered in framed law degrees, plaques, and magazine covers. If you squinted, you might find a family photo tucked among the accolades, but even those looked posed and formal. Elise was everything they'd ever wanted in a daughter. 3 years older, with her polished smile and effortless brilliance, she was the living embodiment of their ambitions. By 16, she'd been featured in Teen Litigator magazine. By 22, she graduated at the top of her Yale Law class. At 25, she'd already secured a coveted clerkship with a federal appellate judge. At every party, every gala, every fundraiser, she was introduced with a kind of reverence. I learned early on that no matter how hard I tried, I would never be Elise. In our house, "Why can't you be more like your sister?" was as common as "pass the salt." The truth is, I didn't even want to be Elise. Not really. While she devoured legal journals, I was captivated by stories of entrepreneurs, by articles about tech startups disrupting entire industries. I dreamed of building something of my own, something that would last, something that mattered on my terms. But in my family, on my terms was never an option. I remember being 15 and staying up all night working on my first real project, a study planner I designed and printed myself. I thought I'd sell a few to classmates, but within weeks, I had orders pouring in from across the district. I was making more than enough to buy my own supplies and even help pay for some of my extracurricular activities. For the first time, I felt like I'd created something that had genuine value. When my mother found out, she was livid. I can still hear the scorn in her voice as she flipped through the order forms I'd proudly organized in a binder. "Harper," she said, her tone dripping with disdain, "this is humiliating. You're the daughter of Charles and Victoria Lawson, not a door-to-door peddler." "I'm not a peddler," I protested. "I'm running a business." She shut the binder and set it aside like something distasteful. "This is a distraction, a phase. You will focus on what matters." And what mattered, according to her, was law. Nothing else. After that, I stopped talking about my dreams. I told myself that maybe if I studied hard enough, something would click. Maybe I'd wake up and feel the passion Elise felt. It never happened. By senior year of high school, my grades were good enough to maintain the family's expectations, but nowhere near Elise's brilliance. At every family event, I stood beside her while relatives showered her with praise before turning to me with thinly veiled pity. "And what about you, Harper?" they'd ask, all sweetness. "Still trying to figure things out?" I would nod and pretend their words didn't sting. The contrast between us was everywhere. Elise had our mother's refined beauty, a tall, elegant presence that commanded every room. I was shorter, softer, with hair that refused to lie flat, and a smile I couldn't force into the polished perfection they wanted. Even my body seemed to disappoint them. "Stand up straight," my mother would snap. "No one takes a slouching lawyer seriously." Sometimes, in those endless evenings where Elise's triumphs were recited like scripture, I wondered if I would ever be more than the family's consolation prize. I didn't know it yet, but the day was coming when I'd finally say no. When I'd tear down the carefully constructed life my parents had planned for me and step into something terrifying and entirely my own. That decision would cost me everything I'd ever known. But looking back, it was the only choice that ever felt like mine. If my high school graduation should have been a moment of pride, for me, it felt like a silent countdown to exile. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Rows of students in cobalt blue robes, parents clustered on the bleachers, all the predictable fanfare. But when my name was called and I stepped up to collect my diploma, I knew my parents weren't really watching. I spotted them in the audience. My mother checking her phone for email updates from her firm. My father speaking in low tones to a judge he'd known since law school. The only person who looked genuinely proud was my best friend Rowan, who whooped and clapped so loud people turned to stare. Afterward, the Lawsons hosted a dinner at our house, ostensibly to celebrate me, but really another chance to showcase the family's legacy. My grandmother, Eleanor, had flown in from New York. Dozens of attorneys my parents mentored over the years arrived with their spouses, greeting Elise like a celebrity. She was home from her clerkship in D.C., and all evening people were congratulating her on her next steps. I sat at the far end of the table, smiling politely, feeling like an intruder in my own life. When the plates were cleared, my father stood up and tapped his glass with the back of a silver fork. "To Harper," he announced in a voice that could have been mistaken for genuine affection if you didn't know him. "Who today joins the long line of Lawsons destined to contribute to the legal profession." Polite applause. Elise gave me a small, patronizing smile. "And," my father continued, "who will be starting Yale Law in the fall?" I felt my stomach flip. "I'm sorry," I blurted, the words louder than I intended. "I'm not going to Yale Law." Every fork in the room froze mid-air. "What did you say?" my mother demanded. I looked down the table and for the first time I let my voice be clear and steady. "I applied to Stanford Business School," I said, my hands trembling under the tablecloth. "And I got in. I've accepted the offer." A hush fell so complete it felt like the house itself was holding its breath. Victoria Lawson's jaw tightened until her cheekbones looked carved from stone. "This is a poor attempt at humor." "It's not a joke," I said, my voice almost calm. "I want to build businesses. I want to create something that matters to me." My father set his wineglass down so hard the stem cracked. "You will withdraw immediately. Do you understand? You will start at Yale in September as planned." "It's not planned," I replied. "Not by me." Elise gave a little scoff. "Of course you'd pull something like this. You've always been unreliable." "I'm not unreliable," I said, feeling the words grow stronger. "I'm just not you." "You're throwing away everything," my mother said, her voice low and furious. "Do you understand that? The name, the connections, the reputation." I met her eyes. "Maybe I don't want them." That was the moment I saw it. The flicker of disgust, of genuine contempt. It's one thing to feel unloved. It's another to have it confirmed in public. When the dinner ended, my parents didn't say a word to me. Guests slipped away in uncomfortable silence. Elise didn't bother pretending to be concerned. The next morning, my father summoned me to his study. I'd seen this ritual before. He'd sat in this same leather chair when he decided to cut off an uncle who'd embarrassed the family name. I knew what was coming before he opened his mouth. If you pursue this fantasy, he said, each syllable deliberate, you will not do so as a Lawson. I swallowed. You're really going to disown me? Victoria was standing near the bookshelves, arms folded, lips pressed into a thin line. You're making this choice, Harper. Not us. I shook my head. You're making me choose between your approval and my own life. My father didn't flinch. Then choose wisely. He slid a folder across the desk. Inside were the documents, the trust fund revocation, the removal of my name from the family estate plans. Legal paperwork drafted before I'd even walked into the room. Take your things, he said quietly. You have until this evening. Elise's voice drifted in from the doorway. Don't be dramatic, she called. Just apologize and do what they want. You know you'll never make it on your own. Something in me snapped. I'd rather fail as myself, I told her, than succeed as your shadow. I packed a single suitcase. My mother didn't come upstairs to say goodbye. My father stayed in his study. Elise watched me load my things into Rowan's car, her arms crossed over her perfect blouse. As we pulled away from the house, I didn't look back. In the moment, it felt like a death. I didn't realize it was actually a rebirth. The first night away from my family, I slept on Rowan's couch, listening to the sounds of her old pipes creaking and her neighbor's television leaking through the walls. In the morning, I woke up certain I'd made the worst mistake of my life. But then, something surprising happened. No one was telling me what to do. No one was measuring me against Elise. No one was reminding me that I was a disappointment. It was terrifying and liberating. I called Stanford the next day to explain my situation. With my trust fund revoked, I didn't have enough to cover the first semester. The admissions office was kind but firm. Without proof of funds, I would have to defer enrollment. That afternoon, I sat in a borrowed chair in Rowan's kitchen, clutching my phone and trying not to cry. Rowan set a mug of coffee in front of me. So, she said gently, what now? I had no idea. The first weeks blurred together. I worked anywhere that would take me, mornings in a coffee shop on Market Street, afternoons answering phones for a boutique accounting firm, evenings restocking shelves at a neighborhood bookstore. I was exhausted all the time, but for the first time, my life belonged to me. Rowan never complained. Even when my boxes took over half her apartment, she only said, "Stay as long as you need." 3 months later, I'd saved just enough to enroll part-time at San Francisco State University. It wasn't Stanford, but it was something. I moved into a tiny studio apartment in Soma. The paint peeled from the walls, the heat barely worked, and the neighbors were prone to screaming matches at 3 a.m. But it was mine. Between classes, I read everything I could find about startups, market analysis, and process improvement. At night, I dreamed about building something that could prove, even to myself, that I hadn't made a colossal mistake. My professors noticed my focus. One of them, Professor Green, was a former startup founder who'd sold his company and turned to teaching. After I turned in a paper proposing a new model for legal document automation, he asked me to stay after class. "Your idea is different," he said, tapping the corner of the page. "Most students in here are thinking about dating apps and subscription boxes. You're looking at the legal sector." Why? I hesitated. For once, I didn't want to talk about my family. "I just grew up around lawyers," I said finally. "I've seen how inefficient the system can be." He nodded. "You should keep going with this. There's a real opportunity." Those words were like oxygen. I didn't have a roadmap. I barely had rent money. But I had an idea. And the first person outside of Rowan who believed in it. By my junior year, that idea had a name: Keystone Solutions. I envisioned software that could transform law firms' workflow, streamlining contracts, automating filings, and freeing attorneys to actually practice law instead of drowning in paperwork. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't flashy. But it was exactly what I'd wished my parents' firm had when I was growing up. Tools that could make their work more human. I worked on the prototype in every spare moment, often falling asleep with my laptop open and my glasses still on. Most nights, I survived on instant noodles and instant coffee. I learned to stretch $20 across a week of groceries. There were days I wanted to quit. Days I questioned whether I was proving a point to my parents or actually building something that mattered. But every time I thought about going back, about surrendering to the life they'd planned for me, I felt a cold dread I couldn't ignore. I'd rather be broke and exhausted than trapped. In my final year, Professor Green introduced me to two software engineers, siblings named Vanessa and Luis, who'd built automation platforms for accounting firms. We started meeting in an old co-working space downtown that smelled like burnt coffee and dry erase markers. They believed in Keystone, enough to accept equity instead of salaries I couldn't afford. I'll never forget the night we launched our first beta test with a small law office in Oakland. I was so nervous my hands shook as I hit deploy. By the end of the week, the office manager called me. "This is incredible," she said, sounding almost giddy. "You've saved us 10 hours a week already." For the first time since I walked out of my parents' house, I felt something like hope. The breakthrough. Our little team grew slowly. One law office became 3. 3 became 6. I still worked my day job at the accounting firm, fielding support calls for Keystone during lunch breaks and late at night. It wasn't glamorous. We were barely scraping by. But we were building something that was ours. 6 months after graduation, Keystone landed a pilot program with a mid-sized San Francisco firm. If it worked, they'd recommend us to their national network. I remember standing in their glass-walled conference room in my only decent blazer, pitching my heart out while Vanessa flipped through slides on a borrowed projector. When we finished, the managing partner leaned back in his chair, studying us. "You know," he said, "I've seen a lot of legal tech companies crash and burn, but you actually understand what lawyers need. You've lived it." He didn't know how true that was. A week later, he signed the contract. We had our first real client, and our first steady revenue. I walked out of that building into the cool autumn air and felt lighter than I had in years. For the first time, I didn't feel like an imposter. I felt like an entrepreneur. The first time I allowed myself to really believe I was building something meaningful was the day I signed the renewal contract with that mid-sized firm. It wasn't the money, though finally seeing a positive balance in Keystone's account was surreal. It was the realization that our software was changing how people worked. We were freeing them from tedious processes so they could focus on what mattered. Ironically, the same profession that had suffocated me growing up was now where I was finding purpose on my own terms. In those early years, I still lived, like bankruptcy was one bad month away. I kept my second job at the accounting firm and drove a battered Honda Civic with more duct tape than paint. Even as Keystone's revenue grew, I refused to pay myself more than the minimum I needed to get by. Vanessa used to tease me about it. "Harper, you know you're allowed to exhale, right?" she'd say. Most founders celebrate a little when they make it past survival mode. But for me, survival mode felt safe, familiar. I didn't know how to let myself feel secure. It was Rowan who finally staged an intervention. She showed up one night with takeout and her characteristic bluntness. "You can't keep living like you're still fighting for a spot at your parents' table," she said. "You've built something real. You deserve to own that." I wanted to believe her, so I tried. Over the next year, Keystone doubled in size. We moved from our scrappy co-working space into a modest suite with actual doors and windows that opened. Clients started calling us instead of the other way around. At night, I'd sit at my desk long after everyone left, looking around the quiet office and thinking, I did this. Not because of the Lawson name, because of me, becoming someone new. As the business stabilized, I started making changes in my personal life too. I hired a personal trainer, partly because I needed the accountability, and partly because I was tired of feeling like I had to shrink myself to be acceptable. I began to cook real meals instead of surviving on instant noodles. I even splurged on a good haircut and a wardrobe that made me feel confident instead of invisible. It wasn't about meeting anyone else's standards. It was about reclaiming the parts of me I'd ignored for too long. I also started therapy. My therapist, Dr. Patel, didn't flinch when I told her about the night my parents disowned me. She only asked, "How much of your success do you think is about proving them wrong?" I didn't know how to answer, because part of me knew she was right. Meeting Adrian. It was during this time I met Adrian Miller. We were both panelists at a legal tech conference in Palo Alto, he representing a prominent intellectual property firm, me representing Keystone. After my talk, he approached me near the refreshment table. "That was impressive," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Adrian." I tried not to look as flustered as I felt. He was the kind of person who exuded quiet confidence, someone who didn't need to prove anything. "Thanks," I replied, shaking his hand. "I'm Harper." "I know," he said, smiling. "We've actually implemented your platform in our San Jose office. It's saved us hours." That caught me off guard. "You're using Keystone?" He nodded. "I've been hoping we'd cross paths." That night, we ended up at the same dinner with other panelists. We sat next to each other, and the conversation flowed easily. Work, travel, everything in between. When he asked if I'd like to get coffee sometime, I almost said no. My life felt too full, too complicated. But there was something about the way he looked at me, not as an obligation or a disappointment, but as a person worth knowing. So I said yes. Letting someone in our first coffee turned into a series of dinners. Each time we met, I felt myself relaxing in ways I hadn't in years. Adrian never treated my work like a novelty or a sideshow. He understood the legal world, and he respected that I'd chosen to approach it differently. One evening, as we walked along the Embarcadero, he stopped and turned to face me. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Walking away from the life you were supposed to have?" I looked out at the water glittering under the city lights. "I used to," I admitted, "when I was broke and scared and alone. But now, I think it was the best thing I ever did." He nodded like he understood, and I think he did. Success on my own terms. A year later, Keystone landed a contract with one of the largest law firms in California. It felt surreal. This was the kind of firm my parents would have killed to impress. The kind of firm that would have been my destiny if I'd followed their path. Instead, they were my client. And they knew me not as Charles and Victoria Lawson's daughter, but as Harper, the founder who had built something they needed. At our kickoff meeting, one of the partners asked if I was related to those Lawsons. I smiled politely. "I'm familiar with them," I said. "But Keystone is my own thing." And that was all I needed to say. Becoming whole. As Keystone grew, so did I. I stopped needing to prove myself to ghosts. I started believing that maybe I was worthy of the life I was building. Not because I'd finally met someone's standards, but because I'd stopped measuring myself by them. One evening, Adrian and I were cooking dinner in my apartment. Something simple, just pasta and salad, and he set down the spoon and looked at me. "You know," he said softly, "I've never met anyone like you." "Like what?" I asked, feeling shy. Someone who fought so hard to be exactly who they are. It was the highest compliment anyone had ever given me, and for once, I let myself believe it. I thought I'd buried the need for my family's approval. I thought I'd outgrown the ache to be seen by them as more than a failure. But when the invitation arrived, heavy cardstock embossed with gold leaf, announcing Elise Lawson's wedding at a luxury Napa resort, something shifted inside me. I wasn't on the guest list, of course. The envelope came addressed to current resident. My mother must have forgotten I'd moved years ago. I turned the invitation over in my hands, studying Elise's perfect engagement photo. She looked radiant, impeccable. Every inch the daughter my parents always wanted. Part of me wanted to toss the card in the recycling bin and never think about it again. But another part of me, the part still carrying a teenage girl's bruises, wondered if I'd ever be truly free without facing them. Dr. Patel said it best during our next session. "You don't need their validation," she reminded me. "But you also don't have to pretend it doesn't hurt. Sometimes revisiting the wound helps it finally heal." Adrian was gentler. "You don't owe them anything," he said as we sat on the couch, his hand warm over mine. "But if you're going to go, go for yourself, not them." I thought about it for days, and then, one morning, I woke up knowing I had to see them, not to beg for reconciliation or to prove anything, but because I was done letting their rejection define me. I didn't need permission to show up. Arriving at the wedding. The resort was exactly what I expected. Sprawling vineyards, white stucco walls gleaming in the late afternoon sun, valet attendants in crisp uniforms. I sat in my car for a long moment, hands gripping the wheel, heart hammering. I'd faced venture capitalists who tried to dismiss me. I'd pitched in boardrooms where no one took me seriously until they saw the numbers. I'd rebuilt my life from scratch. But somehow, nothing had prepared me for walking back into the orbit of Charles and Victoria Lawson. I took a breath, reminded myself that I was no longer the girl who left with a suitcase. I was Harper Lawson, CEO of Keystone Solutions. I'd built something they couldn't take away, so I stepped out of the car, handed my keys to the valet, and walked toward the entrance. Inside, the lobby bustled with guests in designer gowns and tuxedos. Waitstaff offered champagne as music drifted from the ballroom. No one noticed me at first. I slipped along the edge of the crowd, past towering floral arrangements and clusters of familiar faces. I almost made it to the ballroom undetected. Almost. "Harper?" The voice came from my left, my cousin Meredith blinking in confusion. "Oh my God, it is you." She looked me up and down, taking in my sleek navy dress, the way I carried myself now. "You look different." Before I could reply, another voice cut in, sharp and unmistakable. "What is she doing here?" I turned. Victoria Lawson was standing just inside the ballroom doors. She looked almost exactly as she had the day she told me I wasn't a Lawson anymore, except older, the lines deeper around her eyes. People nearby fell silent. "I came to wish Elise well," I said evenly. "That's all." "You were not invited," she hissed, stepping closer. "This day is not about you." "I know," I replied. "That's why I'm not making a scene." My father appeared behind her, his expression carefully blank. "Harper," he said in the same cool tone he'd used when he signed away my inheritance. "Leave, now." I felt dozens of eyes on us. The old Harper would have shrunk, but I stood tall. "No," I said simply. "I'm not here to disrupt anything, but I'm not going to pretend I don't exist." Recognition before either of them could answer, another voice joined the fray, low, surprised, and edged with curiosity. "Harper Lawson?" I turned to see the groom standing a few feet away, tall, dark-haired, wearing a fitted tuxedo. We hadn't been introduced, but I recognized him from legal publications. Daniel Marks, a rising star in corporate law. He looked puzzled. "You're Harper," he said again, almost to himself. "From Keystone?" My mother's head snapped around. "What are you talking about?" she demanded. Daniel ignored her. "Your company, Keystone Solutions." You founded it? Yes, I said, my voice clear. His eyes widened. We use your software at my firm. It's completely transformed our practice. A ripple of murmurs spread through the nearby guests. My father's jaw clenched. My mother's complexion went pale. You built that? Daniel asked, incredulous. I nodded. Yes, I said, I did. The public unraveling. For a moment no one spoke. Then, from behind Daniel, Elise appeared. Resplendent in her gown, her hair swept up in the perfect chignon. She froze when she saw me. What's going on? She demanded. Daniel turned to her, still staring at me. Did you know your sister created Keystone? Elise's gaze flicked between us. No, she said slowly. We don't really talk. A hush fell. It was Meredith who broke the silence. Wait, she said, her voice unsteady. Keystone? The software that everyone's using? I met her eyes. Yes. And then, because there was no point in hiding anymore, I turned back to my parents. You told me I'd never amount to anything without your name, I said softly. But it turns out, my name was enough. Victoria opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Charles looked like he'd swallowed something bitter. Elise only stared, her expression unreadable. Closure security hovered nearby, unsure what to do. For a second, I thought about leaving quietly, but something in me refused to be erased again, so I straightened my shoulders. I wish you all the best, I said, meeting Elise's eyes. Truly. Then I turned to Daniel. I'm glad Keystone has helped your firm, I added. He nodded, his face still a mix of shock and admiration. More than you know, he said. I started to walk away, but Elise reached out, fingers brushing my arm. Harper, she whispered. Wait. I paused. For the first time, her voice held something that sounded almost like regret. But I couldn't do this here. Not today. So I looked her in the eye and said the one thing I needed to say. I'm not angry anymore. I'm free. And with that, I stepped past them all. Out of the ballroom, into the warm Napa night, where Adrian was waiting. Outside the resort, the air was cool and smelled faintly of lavender drifting in from the vineyard rows. Adrian stood beside his car, watching the doorway like he wasn't sure if he'd need to rush inside and rescue me. When he saw me approaching, he exhaled and walked forward to meet me. Hey, he said softly, brushing a stray curl from my cheek. How did it go? I opened my mouth to answer but realized I didn't have words for what I felt. Not triumphant, not devastated, just unburdened. It went exactly how it needed to, I said at last. He searched my face for a moment, then smiled. Come on, he said, opening the passenger door. Let's get you out of here. As we pulled away from the hotel, leaving behind the polished world where I'd never belonged, I felt lighter than I had in years. It was over. Not because they had apologized or accepted me, but because I'd finally accepted myself. The fallout. In the days that followed, the story spread through San Francisco's legal circles. Inevitably, someone had recorded the exchange in the ballroom. The video made its way onto social media, sparking gossip among my parents' colleagues and clients. I heard about it from Rowan first. Harper, she said, barely suppressing her laughter. You're a legend. Do you know how many people have texted me that clip? I rolled my eyes. It wasn't supposed to be a spectacle. Maybe not, she said. But sometimes the truth refuses to stay polite. Even Dr. Patel had seen it. You didn't humiliate them, she told me in our next session. You simply stood in your truth. That's why it resonates with people. I wasn't sure how I felt about becoming a cautionary tale or an example, but I knew I didn't regret it. An unexpected apology. About 2 weeks later, I received an email from Elise. Subject line, "Can we talk?" It took me a full day to decide whether to respond. Eventually, I agreed to meet her for coffee in the Marina District, a neutral place, far from the gravity of our childhood home. When I arrived, she was already seated, hands wrapped around a mug she hadn't touched. She looked different without the veil of wedding day perfection. Her hair was loose, her makeup minimal. When she saw me, she tried to smile, but her eyes were uncertain. "Thanks for coming," she said quietly. I nodded, taking the seat across from her. For a moment, we both just stared at the table. Finally, she cleared her throat. "I wanted to say I'm sorry," she began. "Not just for what happened at the wedding, but for everything." I didn't say anything. I could feel how much effort it took for her to keep speaking. "I let them convince me you were selfish," she went on, "that you were weak. But watching you stand there, owning what you'd built, it made me realize how much I've let them shape me." She looked up, her eyes shining. "You were braver than I ever was." The words settled between us, heavy and undeniable. Part of me wanted to cling to old anger, to remind her how she'd stood by while our parents dismantled me. But the woman sitting across from me wasn't the same sister who smirked as I packed my suitcase, and I wasn't the same girl who left. So I took a slow breath and said, "Thank you. That means a lot." It wasn't a perfect reconciliation, but it was a start. A new mission. In the months after the wedding, something shifted inside me. I'd spent so long running, first from my parents' expectations, then from the fear that maybe they were right about me. But now, with Keystone thriving and my past finally confronted, I realized I wanted to do more. Not to prove anything, but because I knew what it felt like to be cast out for daring to want something different. So I created the Mosaic Initiative, a nonprofit that offered mentorship and scholarships to young people whose families rejected their ambitions. We held our first workshop in a borrowed community center conference room. I expected maybe a handful of applicants. Over 50 showed up. Some wanted to start businesses. Some wanted to study art instead of medicine. Some just wanted someone to tell them they weren't worthless for dreaming differently. Standing at the front of that room, I thought about the girl I'd been at 18. I wished she could have seen this. Building my own family. Through it all, Adrian remained by my side. He never treated my work like a hobby or an oddity. He never compared me to Elise. He never made me feel like I had to be smaller to be loved. One evening, as we watched the sun dip behind the Golden Gate, he took my hand. "You know," he said, "I think you've finally stopped proving them wrong." I looked over, surprised. "What do you mean?" "You're just living," he said simply, "and you're happy." It was true. Not every day was easy. But for the first time, my life wasn't about rejection or defiance. It was about choosing joy. Epilogue. 3 years after Elise's wedding, I married Adrian in a small ceremony overlooking the water. Rowan stood as my maid of honor. Elise came too, standing off to the side with a tentative smile. My parents didn't attend, but as I looked out at the faces of the people who loved me, not because of what I could do for them, but simply for who I was, I didn't feel the lack. Afterward, as the last light faded and the music drifted across the terrace, I felt a peace I never thought possible. Not because I'd finally convinced my family I was enough, but because I'd stopped needing them to say it. Closing message. If you've ever felt like you were failing simply because you wanted something different, I hope you hear this. You are not broken, you are not unworthy, and you are not alone. Choosing your own path will cost you things you can't imagine, but what you gain, self-respect, peace, the chance to build something truly yours, is worth every sacrifice. Family isn't always the people who share your name. Sometimes it's the people who show up and say, "I see you, I believe in you, and I'm proud of who you are. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonates with you, I'd love to hear yours in the comments below. And remember, you are allowed to define your life on your own terms.